Chapter 9, Ceremony and Light. As the ceremony went on, she could feel it getting away from her. No, that was wrong. It was out of her hands from the beginning, like a serpent that she had grabbed by the wrong place and was only turning around and biting her because she had mishandled it. She looked at the Hylian who carried the sword, at length at the hero without looking away, trying to keep her attention focused as was proper, but her eyes darted to the gathered champions. She could see their discomfort, their disappointment, and these were piled on top of hers. Not exactly a proper follow-up to the jubilation and camaraderie that they had all been expressing at having their photograph taken together, but maybe that could be reclaimed, in time. Not now. Link never looked up. His eyes were downcast, his posture studied and perfect, as if he had been practicing it in anticipation of this event. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't had to. Maybe it was like the sword, that he was blessed with perfect piety, and due to the same way he had been blessed with incredible power. "That's not fair," she said to herself. "You don't know what he's had to do. I know what he is now." She knew that he was what she was not, and looking down at him she saw that he was not even sweating, did not betray the merest tremble as he stayed perfectly still in his kneeling position. Her own hand wavered, drifting as a body will when it is made to hold still, and she had to periodically drop it to let her nerves settle before raising it again. This speech was long, but she knew it had to be. Apparently it was something like the speech that had been spoken over the hero 10 millennia ago, in an age of wonders. The length was not the problem. Her weakness was ever the only problem. How much like the hero of the past is he? Has he been reborn, carrying lives of experience and strength inside of him? How nice that must be, how simple. She felt her posture begin to slip, straightened her spine as she came to the end. That each of us might know the peace carried on the backs of the courageous, that our world might bathe in the light of Hylia, and that the kingdom of Hyrule may prosper under your protection. Lift your blade. Lend us your strength, for so long as you are needed. Finally, she lowered her hand, brushing her fingertips against his brow. Wise. He rose slowly, his every motion speaking to the control and mastery he had of his own body. When he stood straight he looked at her, and they were of identical height. If he had stood any closer to her it would have been too intimate, too invasive even for her designated protector, but he observed protocol perfectly. He did not speak, and she felt the weight of his eyes on her, and somehow it was even worse than the other champions. They betrayed their boredom, their empathetic awkwardness, even as they approached now. Link betrayed nothing at all, by expression or by posture or by the language of his body. Would he hold his opinion of her so doggedly to his breast? What were they? She suspected she knew. "Ah, thanks for humoring me there, princess." Dark adjusted his sash's knot. He did that when he was nervous, not wanting to offend. "That was definitely everything I asked for. It was positively funereal." The gathered champions, save Link, flinched from Revali's words, but Zelda found them comforting, in an odd way, now that it was out in the open. She did not need to worry about what Revali was thinking. Not that knowing kept the color out of her face, nor kept the shame from suddenly becoming sharper and more distinct, but at least now she did not wonder. "I suppose I can't hold it against you, given the material you have to work with." And he motioned in Link's direction with one wing, and the hero did not deign to react even to that direct insult. "But still, I don't." "That's enough." Urbosa's tone was that of a matriarch used to speaking to people who needed instruction. But if she had expected Revali to be cowed by her, then her expectations were instantly betrayed. He wheeled on her, eyes narrowed and chest out, and he looked perceptibly larger as his feathers very slightly stood on end. Regardless, the inherent challenge in his stance did not seem to faze her. Urbosa actually grinned, and it was not a grin of amusement. "I would like to formally apologize." Now Mythis turned to draw their attention. She placed one hand against her chest, inclined her head towards Zelda. "Forgive my inattentiveness, princess. I find myself exhausted by the events of the day." A lifeline, and she hated herself because she resented it. After a moment of self-pity at how easily Mytha kept to decorum compared to her, how she had not been the one to quell the rising tension of her champions, she bowed her head in return. "There is no need for apology. The ceremony was for the hero more than anyone else, and I think we can agree that Link has been appropriately attentive." Her attempt at humor registered, and Dark's tension drained out of him, a little, as he chuckled. Link looked at her, but still he said nothing. The ceremony may have been for the hero, but we are no less your champions. Barbossa stepped away from Rivali, who visibly calmed as he was given his own space. All of this is well and good, though Hylian ceremony is not quite like those of the Gerudo. Or the Gorons, or the Zora, or the Rito. She did not have to say. We understand, each of us, our tasks. We also understand that all of this revolves around you, Princess. She stood in thought for a moment, staring off into space, before nodding to herself. Then she smiled at Zelda, and this smile was both affectionate and apologetic. Then she kneeled. It took every fiber of her not to ask Barbossa to get up, not to recoil at what she was doing. Barbossa was the closest thing she'd had to a mother for nearly a decade. Seeing her kneel was anathema. I've already said my oaths to Hyrule, Barbossa said, and we've all sworn to do battle with Ganon and free this land. So now I'm making a different oath to you, the heart of the champions. Do not mistake me, this is more than fealty. This is an oath to the task, to all of us, and to the work we will do together. I will fight Ganon. Unbelievably, Rivali knelt next to Barbossa, and there was no arrogance or anger in him. Everything forgotten, dropped on the ground in favor of something that went deeper than that. Pride, faith, surety in his duty. It was like what Barbossa had, and whatever it was Zelda could not understand because she did not share in it. I will lay down my life for Hyrule, and for you. Dark knelt where he stood, and there was no levity in him. More than that, more than each of these, I will give myself totally over to the cause. I am not the chief of the Gerudo, I am a champion. Mipha, who had set aside so much of the symbols of her status among her own people so that she might wear the champion sash, knelt next to Dirk. I will not fail. I will not fail, said Rivali. And it was a cry against the dark, against a world that would see him fall. I will not fail, said Dirk, and it was the promise of a brother, a son, a father, who understood himself only in the context of how he could help those around him. I will not fail, Mipha said, and there was something there Zelda did not understand, some deep running sorrow that she could not touch, and she thought of Sidon, the little prince. There was a gap between Barbossa and Mipha. Into this gap Link stepped, his eyes trained carefully on her face. He bent the knee to her, said nothing, his oaths were clear in every part of him. Of course he wouldn't fail, the sword on his back was his oath, his testament, and his glory. Finally he lowered his eyes. Finally he released her from the weight of his judgment, and still he left her with no understanding. The other champions bore their hearts with every word, but his remained close to her. And then, I will not fail. Quite hesitant, but there. She turned away from them, from her champions who would make war with evil on her behalf, and looked to the castle in the distance. Could her father see her from there? She wondered. Was he looking even now? Was he watching, as she was surrounded by the courageous, who were so much more than she was even as they lifted her up? She wished very badly that her mother was there. She did not find her words for a long time. She gasped, pulled back to the world as if waking from a dream, the past fading from her vision like parchment set upon flame. It had been there a moment ago. She had been living it as vividly as she was living now, could feel the act of making choices and the possibilities that stretched out of individual moments. And for 1 second she swooned because it felt like she could have changed the past. Pai's hand closed firmly around her elbow, steadying her, and she leaned gratefully on her companion. Wait. She said this because she was still unsure, because awareness was coming back in spurts, because something was still changing inside of her. Pai waited as bidden. She was good at waiting. Zelda took a deep breath through her nose and held it. That sense of moving through time like a room was still with her, as if she could step sideways into some unnamed angle and emerge in the same place 20 years ago, or 100, or 1,000, and find it no more difficult. This was not true. She was not one of the gods. But you carry one's power. Their strength is yours, and how far does Hylia's dominion reach? She laid her free hand on the one holding her elbow and squeezed Pai's fingers, anchoring herself. It passed, and the world grew right-sided and concrete. She was no longer dreaming. Save that something was different, deep down on the very floor of her awareness. She could not have said what it was, knowing only that it was there. I think I resented him, too, Zelda said, and she turned her attention to the place where the champions had kneeled 100 years ago. He was so powerful, so righteous. I thought that quality was something inborn, that it had been granted to him by the gods without the pains that they had visited on me. She swallowed. All the champions were so strong and good. I remember being close to each of them, in their way, and how much it shamed me to disappoint them. But I only thought this thing of Link, because he carried the sword that sealed the darkness. You are under a very great deal of pressure, Pi said, trying to be gentle, testing Zelda's balance. I still am. That doesn't. It's not a good excuse for that. She stopped, thought. She was still that person from 100 years ago, wasn't she? She had these small memories, but not the attendant knowledge and experiences that informed them. Was this new life like a resetting of herself, an absolution of her past and her sins and her failures? She could feel herself from 100 years ago as truly as she felt herself. All she had to do was remember, and it was like stepping back into that other life. Every time she remembered some new thing she changed, partially because the goddess's power kept growing inside of her and partially because the experience of being herself also changed her, the way she saw herself and her relationship with the world around her. Zelda. Pai's eyes were soft with concern. You look lost. I want you to know you can talk to me. Even if I don't understand what you're experiencing, talking will help. Oh. It might. Anyway. She released the pressure on Pai's fingers and Pai let go of her elbow so she stood under her own power. For one moment, very briefly, she wondered if perhaps she could or even should keep this to herself, but no, she had asked too much of Pai and Pai had given too much of herself for Zelda to think that it was right to keep anything from her. Every time I remember something new, she said, I feel as if I am losing some part of myself. It is as if there are 3 women inside of me, the person you are talking to now, who woke up without her memories, the Princess Zelda, who 100 years ago failed in her battle with the calamity and loved the hero, even though she hated him too, and the 3rd person, Ancient, who is at one with the power of the goddess. An idea flitted through her mind like a cinder on the wind, and it was so bright and shining that she could not divorce herself from it, not until it was spoken and out in the air. I think I am the 1st person. But I also think that, perhaps the more I remember, the more the other 2 begin to rise. Her hands were shaking. She balled them into fists, but that didn't help. Now her arms were trembling, and she could feel the world slipping away under her. I think this is what is called an existential crisis. Isn't that funny? It was not funny. She knew that her voice communicated that it was not funny. Batu was on the edge of panicking, and she could see how nervous and helpless she was making Pai feel, but now the cinder was out, and it needed more air, more breath, more fuel. She couldn't stop. It feels as if I continue on my quest and remember more and more, the princess and the goddess will continue to grow. And I may disappear. Pai's hands were shaking worse than hers were, but still she managed to take both of Zelda's in hers. To Kirk's the fists opened and pressed their hands together. She couldn't look at Zelda, was shaking from a kind of nervousness utterly apart from the kind she carried with her into and after battle, but her grip was very strong. I will help, Pai said, insistent even as her voice quavered. And no matter what happens, I'll anchor you, so no matter how much you remember, or how strong these other thoughts are, you won't disappear. She fought, visibly, to raise her eyes enough to meet Zelda's, and Zelda began to understand something she had not understood before. I will keep you here. We'll keep helping each other, for as long as it takes. I promise. She embraced Pai, in warmth and thanks and sorrow, and the other woman was stiff in her arms, but that was all right. She let go quickly, and Pai murmured something inaudible while backing up. She had heard her again. She would hurt her more before this journey was through. More sorrow. Fears piled on top of each other, a bundle of snakes that writhed and dripped venom into common pools, giving rise to new fears, new shapes for old ones, and a sickness of the heart that she did not know if she could deal with. She hadn't been afraid for herself 20 minutes ago, hadn't been afraid for her identity and the sense of freedom that had come with it. Should she feel that change? Didn't every person change as they grew and learned and loved? And it was normal and safe and even a happy thing to change. Every step on the path was leading her to some new memory, an increasing potential for losing herself, and that possibility was ice in her stomach. They were so close to Hyrule Castle that when the calamity roared, they felt the earthquake. The blue light erupted from the castle's keep, so bright that it threw the overgrown clearing into stark relief, and both of them looked toward us in time to hear the high, clear notes of an ancient voice singing a song they could not recognize. He is still fighting. Link is still fighting. While I am afraid, while I worry over what will happen to me, he continues the battle he joined 100 years ago on my behalf. I am alive and enjoy this freedom because he gave himself to a war that is more terrible than the one I waged. She looked over at Paya, saw tears running down the other woman's face. It was something in the music, in the voice, that spoke to a part of them so deep it bordered on the primal. It communicated in so few notes the nature of the war being waged, the hero struggling forever against the dark. The light faded, and the singing with it. I think, Zelda said, that we need to put ourselves to something concrete. Not memories or the stuff of gods and wars and quests. We need something that we can work on and finish. Together? Paya blushed again and nodded, turned her eyes to the south, and listened. There is a guardian immediately to the south of us. I think it's the same one that we avoided on our way here. It isn't aware of us, but it's tending toward this direction. Its path may bring it near enough to detect us in the next few minutes. Do you think that a mobile guardian would be more likely to survive attempts to dissect it? Paya made a face, with effort, trying to seem more casual and familiar than she felt, managing to communicate that she liked neither the idea of confronting a guardian nor the expression of that feeling. I'm not an expert, but I don't see why it would be. It was true that the malice infected each of the guardians and actually had a mildly corrosive effect. This was the simplest explanation for why the targeting systems for their weapons were slowed and wreckers from 100 years ago seemed to indicate. Still, if they were mobile, that meant that they had experienced less corrosion, for one reason or another, than their immobile peers. I think it's worth a shot. The Guardian's many legs propelled it along the ground, low but aloft, easily adjusting to sudden shifts in terrain. The ease with which it hoisted itself over a stray boulder, the automatic adjustment of its central body so that it remained upright and properly oriented, was a marvel of engineering so sublime that simply watching it could not engender appreciation for it. Few were those living who would think much of it, fewer still those who would know the fineness of its craftsmanship, the singular skill of its construction. More, far more, would appreciate the menace of its wide, burning eye as it scanned the environment. Its sensors reached no further than its immobilized counterparts, but that reach was far indeed. It detected movement, heat, life as it passed near a small copse that surrounded the remains of a courtyard. Instantly it turned its eye in that direction, seeking visual confirmation, and the sound of its clawed appendages digging into the dirt was softer than one might expect, no more than stones hitting the grass. A few meters behind the tree line, a particular trunk fell with a burst of light, an explosion. The Guardian sprinted, seeking a target, and a chime like an enormous bell rang out. The Guardian was fast, covering hundreds of meters with a speed greater than a horse could hope to match, but it was also observant, registering and recording the repeated impacts of weapons that reverberated similarly to the chime that had rung out a moment before. Then there was another explosion, though this time no trees fell. Nah! A Hylian voice, and a flash of Hylian silhouette, and its targeting systems painted that body with red light. Its capacitor was fully charged, waiting for confirmation of targeting lock, and then there was another chime, somewhat louder than before. A fallen tree trunk soared out of the copse like a spear hurled by God. The Guardian's targeting line was broken, and it had time to interpret that it was under attack just before the projectile smashed into its eye. The log exploded on impact, shivering to pieces in a cloud of splinters and dust, and the Guardian was rocked backward by the force of the blow. Its legs collapsed, body crashing to the ground as the shock to its primary sensor sent its systems into a short reboot sequence. Two figures ran out of the wood, one holding a sword made of blue light, the other a bow of darkened wood. "You're stronger than I am," Zelda had said. "You have to be the one to handle this part." "I don't know if that's true anymore." Her reply had been truthful, but not by much. The blessings of the goddess had begun to tell in the princess's body, and the blessings of the grey fairy had armored her against harm, but there were limits to which Paya had not been pushed. "We have to assume it is until proven otherwise. You're better suited for either task, so it makes sense that you would do the more important one." But what if its weapon fires at you? I don't even know how deep to try to cut, or how wide to make the opening, or anything. I'm better protected, thanks to Kotera, and the effective firing angle is narrow enough that I think we can avoid it. And there's nothing to know. The armor is 2 inches thick, uniformly, and you will have another 2 inches of clearance before reaching any vital components. That's not very much room for error. I have absolute faith in your abilities. If you stab into it at the right angle, especially if you can find a flaw or damaged spot, you should be able to pierce it with just the strength of your arm. Then you can saw at it to make an opening, about 2 feet wide. Saw at it? That will ruin the blade. It's a blade of light. It doesn't need sharpening like a steel one does. It still experiences physical strain, because the emitter is the fulcrum point for force applied against the blade. If we put it under too much stress, it could be damaged. She had felt a small thrill of pleasure at how this objection took Zelda back. She didn't know as much about ancient technology as Antipura, but at least she knew enough for this. That pleasure had withered at the set of Zelda's mouth and the lowering of her eyebrows as she weighed the possibilities. That's just a risk we're going to have to take. So here they were, now. Zelda was dressed in the Hylian-style tunic, since it provided better protection, and holding a Sheikah-made bow that granted greater accuracy if held by a steady hand. The initial impact of the stasis-propelled tree had stunned the Guardian long enough to approach it, and now each time it began to recover, Zelda put an arrow in its eye, making it collapse again. Zelda had bought every arrow in Kakariko, and the Fletcher had made a very great deal more than usual in hopes that the princess would requisition, not purchase but requisition, more if she wanted to. Zelda could probably lock down the Guardian for hours with being interrupted. Haya hoisted herself onto the Guardian's back, setting her feet just below the segmentation between the Guardian's body and what she thought of as its head. It still twitched as it recovered, rotating by small degrees, but hopefully it wouldn't be too much to work through. That wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the armor itself, not the thickness of it, or the hardness of it, or the particular ways it might be able to disperse kinetic or thermal energy. The problem was that, on top of all of these things, it was also smooth and angled to turn away blows of force. If she wanted to pierce it without the blade skidding all over the place, then she was going to need to find a flaw. She could make one herself. One good slash would probably open a divot in it large enough to steady the tip of the blade, but she wanted to be able to use a deeper crevice, if there was one. She was lucky. After a few seconds scanning, she found a missing chunk of armor, what was very nearly a pit where it looked like a spear may have struck it in some past battle. Whoever had wielded that weapon was stronger than a person. She wondered if she was looking at a wound that dated from before the Calamity's prior sealing, back in the truly old war. She placed the tip of the blade against the crack in the armor, gripped the handle with her left hand to steady it while placing her right against the pommel, and shoved. There was a crack like pottery breaking, and the blade sank in an inch. To check if it would come free, she pulled, and when the blade retracted without resistance, she shoved again, slightly harder. Another crack, and now there was no more resistance as the blade broke cleanly through the outer layer of armor. "How's it going back there?" The Guardian shifted, its legs beginning to brace themselves against the ground, and then Paya heard the impact of another arrow hitting its eye. "I think I'm through the armor." "Good. Try to be careful. You only have that much more clearance before you reach the internal components." She did not need to be told again. Carefully she withdrew the blade, and found that it easily slid out, as if it grew thinner, or was already infinitely thin. Looking at the blade edge made her eyes hurt, so she was not absolutely sure. Still. "Okay, Haya. Relax. If you have 2 inches of clearance and the armor is 2 inches thick, then you can allow yourself 3.5 inches per stroke. That shouldn't be too hard." Even trying to pep herself up, she was not very convincing. Still, she began to saw in short, quick, powerful motions, placing as much pressure as she could on each thrust or draw. The smell it made was interesting, definitely burning, but not burning of a kind she had smelled before, like meat or vegetables or overdone pottery. Black flakes drifted down as she sawed, ashes from the armor being obliterated by the knife, and she wondered if they would be toxic to inhale. Probably. Best not to breathe it in, regardless. Though the armor, in its destruction, could be producing vapors that were just as dangerous. The blade was designed in such a way that heat and kinetic energies were shunted away at all costs. That is why Paya did not feel the emitter grow hot as she saw the roughly triangular opening, did not experience some sense of heat or warning as the blade's mount began to hiss. It cut easily enough through the armor, and she was going at speed. That was all that mattered. The opening would be about 2 feet wide on each side, which should be enough for Zelda to reach inside of it and see what she needed to see. Later, she would decide that she had been too focused on the act of sawing, that the focus required to use such small, even strokes from a strange position for an extended period of time compromised her ability to notice the state of her weapon. She never said such a thing to Zelda because she knew Zelda would want to absolve her, and one should not be absolved of negligence. It was why she did not realize that the sword, which was very much meant for slashing rather than chopping and most definitely not for sawing, was at its breaking point as she came around to the end of the last side. It was why she was so surprised when it burst in her hands. Zelda. She took a moment, the reboot sentence completed, and the light in the Guardian's eye flickered off and on for half a second before it began to move again. She loosed her arrow, waited for the impact, exhaled as the life went out of the machine again. Yes. The blade shattered. She fought down a groan. When you say shattered, what do you mean? The handle burst. The emitter seems to have exploded, and every component I can see is smoking. In spite of her own anxieties, Zelda more sharply felt Paya's. She had been right, and she sounded like in reward for being right she had broken the world. Paya was trying very hard not to panic. Did you finish? It's difficult to tell. There's a lot of smoke. Another twitch. Another arrow, another impact. Switch places with me. They moved quickly, dashing past each other so that Zelda did not hear the apology that she knew Paya was trying to get at as she took the bow from Zelda's hand. She clambered up the side of the Guardian opposite its eye, banging her knee heavily on one of its legs as she hoisted herself up. Paya released an arrow with absolute precision. Zelda knew that she would continue to do so until she ran out of arrows, and so put it out of her mind. Paya's summary of the Guardian blade's condition had been accurate, in that there was essentially nothing left of it and it was completely beyond repair. Fine. Tend to that later. Instead, she turned to the opening that Paya had been working on, tracing from the point of initial incision and outlining a sort of rounded triangle, until it summarily ended in a scorch mark that was perhaps connected, perhaps not. The margin was too narrow for her to say one way or the other. It was not the fact of breaking the armor that was the real problem in this context, or even the loss of the weapon. What Zelda was afraid of was the possibility that the discharge had damaged the interior components of the Guardian. They could test its condition, perhaps, by letting it recover long enough to try to attack them. Well, we'll return to that idea later, she said to herself, taking out the narrow Sheikah short sword that Paya had lent her. Let's see. If the energy of the blade is able to cut through the armor's material, then it's possible that the sudden flare of it may have compromised its structural integrity, at least at the point of exposure. Stooping against the Guardian, putting her hand against it as if to steady it and keep it from moving, she leaned in close to peer at the place where the blade had almost punched through. Gingerly she placed the tip of the eightfold blade against the last width of armor, which was blackened and smelled terribly. It felt different enough, from that first point of contact. With the same carefulness, fearful of damaging the blade, even though it was easily replaced and Paya would definitely blunt it on a rock if Zelda asked her to, she pressed more firmly, trying to cut at it. Ash fell away from beneath the blade. In that one spot the armor had been reduced to a state not far removed from charcoal. Caution gone, Zelda pulled back and struck hard with the sword, and the armor shifted and groaned as the last connection broke. She pressed the sword in, angled it, and wrenched as hard as she could, and the cut segment of armor fell free, battering down the side of the Guardian before hitting the grass. Zelda? I'm alright. Hiya. That was the armor falling away. You got it open. She hoped the words would be enough to lay Paya's anxieties to rest, but did not ask because in that moment she had something she wanted much more desperately to examine. The opening Paya had cut was very nearly a triangular window. She tested its edge, found that it was not hot and that the interior of the Guardian radiated no particular heat, then braced herself against it and leaned in to look inside. What in the world? The exact nature of the machinery that she was looking at escaped her. Perhaps Pyrrha could have illuminated the functionality of certain parts, or the piping that fed reservoirs of glowing liquid to various inner mechanisms before draining them back into reservoirs that sat atop carved lumps of bluestone, or the interlacing servos that were hooked into what she assumed were the drive motors for the Guardian's legs, or the vast array of strange machinery that she guessed were its suite of targeting mechanisms and weapon systems. But Pyrrha was not there. She took the shake slate from her hip and snapped several photographs from multiple angles, swearing that she would discuss the specific elements in excruciating detail. But this was just a delaying tactic on her part. The inside of the Guardian was a treasure trove of information and potential for future learning, but it wasn't what she was really paying attention to. It was what she was looking at so that she could try to ignore the malice. The interior of the Guardian was infested with it. The inside of the armored housing stained and acrid with smoke that had accumulated into a film that looked viscous to the touch. Purple fire and arcs of unnaturally colored electricity crackled between components that could not have been meant to support them, and as she watched she knew on a deep, intuitive level that the power of the calamity was eating away at the inside of it. She knew that this was wrong, that the Guardian was not functioning as it should, and that she could know more. Her awareness was different now. She could feel the malice and the power that it was trying to mask as clearly as she could feel the strength of her own limbs. Hylia's power, Hylia's awareness, brought closer to the surface by the power of her memory. It had terrified her only minutes ago, but now, here, she needed it with a desperation that was more than physical. Sutter reached within herself, drawing upon the well of her power. She needed only a sliver, only the tiniest part. A piece so small that the calamity could not possibly feel it while locked in battle with the hero. In her mind it was only enough to fit on the tip of her fingernail, a point of light that would be lost among stars if held to the sky. This light, this power, she drew out from inside of herself and willed into the space behind her eyes. She felt the knowing spread, the understanding, and looked again into the Guardian's heart. "There you are," she said. She could see the rivers of the Guardian's power coursing through it, systems feeding into other systems that fed into more systems, and she saw that there were carefully partitioned redundancies so that damage to smaller parts would not cripple the larger ones. This was why the Guardian was still able to move in spite of the corrosive effect of the malice, why it could continue to serve the calamity even as Ganon's strength ate it from the inside. All of the systems were fed by rivers of power and information, but those two were the same thing, light and legend married in a suspension that was nearly fluid, that flowed from the same source. That source, an orb at the conjunction between the weapon systems and the motor controls, was the heart of the Guardian. It was also where the malice was nested. This energy, this power, is derived from the blue stones that sit in the Guardian's base. I don't know what, but... She paused, breathed slowly, sighed. No, that's not true, and I shouldn't lie to myself. These are stones that are aligned with Hylia, that are derived from her element and draw strength from the world according to her design. They are attuned to her, which means they are attuned to me, which means the Guardians themselves are, which means all Sheikah technology might be. The core crackled as she looked at it, as if to threaten her. She raised her head from the opening. Hiya. Yes. She sounded happier now, but she also heard the urgency in Zelda's voice. What is it? I'm going to try something, and there's a chance it might go wrong. When I give the signal, I want you to stop shooting the Guardian unless it actively targets you. If I shout, then I want you to forget the Guardian and hold on to me, so I can teleport us out of here. Understand? She knew Pi understood. She did not wait for the answer. Instead, she leaned back into the opening, drawing out more of the power within herself. The Guardian was so full of malice that it could have probably spread the infection on its own, but the active portion of it was confined to the core. If she was right, then a properly portioned amount of her power could burn the malice out of the core, and from there it was possible that the Guardian's systems would spread her power through its body, cleansing it using the same channels that had been used to infect it with the corruption. If she was right, and that was a powerful if. But then, no, it wasn't. She knew. She drew on her power, praying that it would not be so much that the calamity would hear her, willing it silent and still inside of her until she used it. The light flared within her. The world in her head turned golden, but she willed it down, under the surface of her skin, and she shifted the pull until all of the power she'd drawn was in her index finger. The power that could be contained in one finger against the malice seated in the Guardian's core. Surely that was enough. She reached out to the core, felt the malice inside of it hiss and tried to push back against her. She pressed her fingertip against the smooth surface, and her power was like a buffer between herself and the corruption, so that she was aware of it, but it could not hurt her. The feeling of being protected by her own strength was, briefly, intoxicating. Zelda held that feeling of herself touching the darkness, wanting to remember how this felt for the future, and then poured her power forward. The malice and Hylia's strength welled within the core, light and dark, two differently colored liquids that refused to mix. Even from a distance, and without drawing on more of her power, she could feel the conflict between the two energies, how the malice fought to maintain its own integrity as her power tried to burn it away, and the core rattled in its casing from the force of the conflict. After what seemed too long a time, she wondered if perhaps she hadn't put enough into it, if the core did not have the capacity to hold both powers in quantities that would allow one to defeat the other, if the whole thing would explode with her staring at it, and then wouldn't she really be testing Code Terra's work? The malice winked out like a candle being snuffed, and the core was filled with light. The light spread at speed, blood flowing through her body carried on the beating of a mighty heart, and she saw as her strength burned away the darkness. There was power there, not just in the act but in the feeling, the knowing that she had done so much and could do so much more. Hylia. She took several more snapshots, then returned the shake slate to her waist. Stop shooting. She climbed down slowly, carefully, as the Guardian came back to life. Hylia still had the bow drawn taut, kept it trained on the Guardian's face just in case, but Zelda walked over to her slowly, hoping that the leisure of her pace would communicate how little there was to fear. Maybe it did, but that hardly mattered. Even when Zelda was standing right next to her, wiping the sweat from her own brow, the tension never left Pai's body. She was in another place, a place that Zelda did not or could not know, where the only thing that mattered was the fulfillment of duty. The only sensation was of the bite of the string against her fingers. The Guardian rose, its eye blinking into blue life with a low hum. Pai tracked it precisely but would not fire. The targeting system on the Guardians were enough of an early warning sign that, so long as they stayed in front of it, it couldn't be too much of a danger to them. Its great eye turned to them, and the aperture behind its lens shifted and contracted as it focused on them. The moment stretched out, and Zelda could hear things as clearly as words spoken, the shifting of the motors that drove the Guardian's legs, the servo mechanisms constantly adjusting its balance to keep it upright, the gentle creak of the bow as Pai pulled it even tighter. She could feel the quiet beneath the noises. The sun was very warm, out on the field. The Guardian turned away from them and stepped slowly but surely back toward its previous path, light shining out of the hole they had made in its armor. Its steps were heavier than she had thought. She could feel it in the ground as it moved, and as it scanned the horizon she thought that perhaps it would return to its original purpose. Probably it would keep to its prior patrol path, but she also thought that perhaps it would see manifestations of the malice, geese, bokoblins, even other Guardians, and act on them in ways that would surprise its targets. She wondered if, without its components being degraded and insulated by the powers of the calamity, its targeting systems might return to their original efficacy. She hoped so. When it was out of range of her arrow, Pai slowly lowered the bow and released the tension she had kept it under. Her arms were shaking from the strain of holding it taut for so long, but she didn't seem aware of it. She looked at the retreating Guardian and her eyes were wide and wondering. Zelda thought, perhaps, that Pai had seen that same look on her face. What happened? Pai said. I think something important. Let's go. I have things I want to ask Pyrrha, and to show her. She took Pai's arm, and the two of them disappeared in rising strings of light. End of chapter.